And tonight I have a very special guest, Philip Coppens. He is an author and investigative journalist ranging from the world of politics to ancient history and mystery. He co-hosts the Spirit Revolution radio show with his wife Kathleen and is a frequent contributor to Nexus Magazine and Atlantis Rising Magazine. He has just released a brand new book called The Ancient Alien Question, and he is a frequent guest on Ancient Aliens on the History Channel. He also just helped to edit the new book Odyssey of the Gods by Eric Van Daniken, and he's going to be discussing that book also tonight. So we have an array of different topics to discuss tonight, but basically what we're really tuning into is the ancient alien question and what it has to do with the timing that we're going through now. And we are live tonight. If you have questions and you would like to ask Philippe a question, you can certainly call in, or you can send me an quick message live on achieveradio.com, and we would be happy to take your calls and questions tonight. Welcome, Philip. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Well, I'm very excited to have you here because your publisher got me a copy of this book rather quickly, and I've been able to kind of look through it and get an idea of what this is about, and it's quite fascinating. So I'd like you to start, if you will, with talking a little bit about your new book, and then we'll get into Eric Van Daniken's book. But where are we, and how did you get into this topic, and just kind of give us a background and where we're at now.
Well, I began to be interested in ancient history, basically when I was a young child. I remember when I was 10 years old, and I was doing reports on the Great Pyramid and various other monuments. So definitely this interest in ancient history has always been with me. But I then became a teenager, and like all teenagers probably lost this interest somewhat and substituted it with other interests. But in the early 1990s, I was working as an investigative journalist, mostly into politics, and two books came to the forefront, which a publisher wanted me to promote, and one of them had to do with the potential discovery of the lost civilization of Atlantis, in which a Belgian historian, Marcel Massac, had made quite stunning revelations. And it's actually one of my upcoming projects to kind of like bring that about to a English language audience. And the other one had to do with the mystery of Rennes Chateau. So over time, these topics remained at the forefront of my interest, and really more and more I began to explore these, and like everybody else, I think, began to realize that there were severe questions which history wasn't answering. And I was not the first, nor the only one who clearly identified that there were bits and chunks missing from our historical timeline. It's precisely what got Eric Van Daniken going into the history questioning as well. And really, what it came about was that in 1995 I was invited by Eric to speak at his World Conference in Bern, and I spoke at two consecutive conferences in 1997 in Orlando and 1999 in the German town of Gelsenkirchen. So my interest and my connection with the ancient alien question, so to speak, goes back to those times. And basically what the book is about is as you said, there is an extremely popular television series called Ancient Aliens on the History Channel. And it's almost finished. It's almost has its final episode of the third season. And basically what it does, it is going back to questioning whether or not we were alone in the past, and presenting evidence to suggest that clearly the answer that we were visited by otherworldly intelligences is quite straightforwardly a likelihood, if not a positive. And so I explore this in this book as well, to an extent that it is written for a general market, and it basically is there to answer at a very basic level whether or not we have been visited. And I'm presenting some of the evidence, the best evidence. I'm also presenting some of the traps, some of the stories which are going around, some of the big theories that certain people adhere to and how they came about. And so basically you get a general picture, but also what I am underlining is that, there's a reason why the ancient alien question has not really been answered, why science isn't willing to negotiate. Like there's the old saying about how the American government is unwilling to negotiate with terrorists. Well, there is the same standoff with scientists who are unwilling to engage in these kinds of debates. They are very narrow in their approach. And basically the end conclusion is that when it comes to have we been visited or not, the answer really has to be yes, we have been visited in the past. But you can, if you so want to, put the bar of evidence so high that nothing will ever satisfy you. In fact, one of the early book reviews are in, and the first one there was by a person who basically said that that the book didn't answer his that the book didn't answer what he was looking for, because his bar of what would constitute positive evidence that we have been visited in the past by extraterrestrial beings was if we were to find an alien spaceship, then be able to retro-engineer it, and then that it would prove that the mechanism of propulsion would identify without a shadow of a doubt that we today or our ancestors in the past would not at all have been able to create this. So it's an extremely high bar to place, because at a very word go, it somehow would say that, even if something crashed 10 or 5,000 years ago, that it is still intact and that we could retro-engineer it. So really it is that attitude which I also am exposing within science, in the sense that if they are confronted with these things, the scientist will quite often say, we know it is impossible. We just know. And when you ask them how do they know, then they will repeat, but just at a louder tone, saying, we know. And that is supposed to be, like a scientific argument. And
sorry.
And it is laughable, but it is unfortunately the way these things go. The best example is I always think as Dr. Zahi Hawass in Chasing Mummies, when literally that situation happens. And I mean, just to give one more example, in 2008, I was at a scientific conference on the Bosnian pyramids, and there were 25 leading Egyptologists there, deans of faculties of archaeology and Egyptology, and people who are considered to be the true leaders in their field. And there was I, a small journalist, and after my 15-minute or 20-minute presentation, they came to me because what I had said was the following, that the Egyptian pyramids were no longer the oldest in the world, because archaeologists had identified pyramids in Peru which were dated to 3200 BC. And these leaders in the field of pyramidology had never heard of this, that their colleagues had done this. They are so isolationist in their studies that, basically somebody who is an expert in Egyptian pyramids had no idea that they were no longer the oldest pyramids, or to that extent, had never heard that there were pyramids elsewhere in the world. And that is really, why we are, why it's basically up to me, or not up to me, but why the book The Ancient Alien Question is written by me and not by scientists, because scientists are so insular that it'll take several decades before they will actually write a book like this.
Well, I think most of my listeners have gotten beyond the scientific prove it to me attitude, I hope. At least, I mean, I've had quite a few people on this show that have really catapulted us as an audience into a different kind of state of awareness when it comes to this. And so the reason I wanted to have you on the show was because I was quite fascinated with your work and how you tie in the ancient places to the ETs, because my work with the indigenous cultures has a long history of being able to show that, we were in fact visited, and why mainstream refuses to really acknowledge that. Or when you go into the UFO subculture, usually what happens is it's kind of like Roswell is what started everything, and people don't like to go past or, further back beyond Roswell most often. So unfortunately, there seems to be, and maybe I'm wrong, but it seems to be this kind of division where people either get onto this subculture and go from Roswell forward, or they actually get on where you are and they're back into the ancient worlds. They're back into the Greek cultures, the Egyptian cultures, and before that, and then also into the indigenous cultures where we have all of these cave markings and different evidence right across the board that they were there, not only in that particular way, but also in their myths and their stories, and they're starting to come forward with a lot of it. In fact, Nancy Red Star is writing a book that comes out in August of 2012 called Star Ancestors and Extraterrestrial Contact in the Native American Tradition. And she is revealing a lot of the ancient wisdom keepers' details on these things, because it's time. They feel that it is time for all of this to come forward. I'm also a big fan of Barbara Hand Clow. I'm not sure if you're familiar with her work, but she has also done a lot of really thorough research on the ancient sites and the different timelines. And so basically, I guess, my point is, and my question is too, is that do you feel that we almost have to rewrite our history to really be able to connect backwards? Because when we start to look at the evidence with the way these sites were created, how they were created, it just makes sense that this was something that we are not aware of technically in our scientific world as it is now. But do you think that the average person who looks into this stuff needs to almost get over or wake up from the fact that they've been indoctrinated into a false history?
Yes, I think they need to understand that, science at this moment in time is dogmatic. The big awakening for me was that I was writing, I had to address this issue of the origins of life on planet Earth, because this is something which is tying into the ancient alien question. One of the things is this: if ET came here, there are stories of ET interbreeding with us, and the classic paradigm of science is basically saying, well, that's impossible because they would be so diverse from us that it's like trying to, us to mate with a dinosaur, and there would probably be a better chance of procreation with us with a dinosaur than with ET coming to planet Earth. So what I was looking at was basically where we were with this theory of panspermia, which is basically something which the discoverers of the DNA structure, people like Francis Crick, were saying that DNA was simply too complex to have originated on planet Earth, and that it had to come from somewhere else. Season 3 of Ancient Aliens featured Chandra Wickramasinghe, leading professor from Wales. And when I started looking into Chandra's work, not so much like his scientific world, but like his life story, I became appalled, because basically what he is saying is that since 1982, he and his colleagues have been the victims of what he calls a conspiracy of silence, whereby basically the journals of science, the scientific journals, are not allowing him or anybody else who is pushing forward evidence that shows, not suggests, but shows that life came from elsewhere in the universe to planet Earth. They just don't publish it. This is why NASA, whenever they are making announcements, like when it's the Mars meteorite, Wolf Simon, or anything else, they are bypassing the scientific journal approach, because they know that they won't get published. It goes just by press release. NASA is reduced basically to do science by press release, because their entire astrobiology department pretty much knows that they will not be able to get published anywhere. and what they are discovering, these extremely advanced scientists, because astrobiology by default is an advanced scientist. Any evidence of astrobiology which you will find by default will be that there is life elsewhere in the universe. But basically, when some of these scientists reproduced interstellar space in laboratories, what they found was that the building blocks of life, DNA and RNA, began to be composed out of this interstellar space on their own. And basically, they have come to the conclusion that life is a cosmic imperative, and that life anywhere in the universe is very much on par with life here. It would have DNA as a basis, and would pretty much result as generating life, which is pretty similar to ours. Now, that is a stunning conclusion. If anything is earth-shaking at this moment in time when it comes to science, that is it. But it's pretty much the way science is treating this entire discipline is very much on par with the Inquisition in the 16th century. And so I think what is happening is that people are awakening to this fact that we are to some extent being shown a disservice by science. And academics, for example, it's off topic from an ancient alien point of view, but it applies just as well. Is there life after death? Things like the near-death experience. We have hundreds of doctors who are publishing reports of near-death experiences with their patients. Some of these doctors, surgeons, have even experimented or are experimenting as we speak during surgeries. By basically locating little objects in the operating rooms, which they know that if their client comes back afterwards and says, "Hey, we saw this," then that by default that person must have been out of his body, even though according to the known laws of science, so to speak, that person was under narcosis. So that as a discipline, science is just not interested and says like, well, that's not anything we are supposed to be investigating. So it's a very reductionist point of view. And the big questions of life, are we alone? Is there such a thing as God? What happens when we die? What about reincarnation? What about miracles? What about apparitions? All of these things. Science has basically two approaches. One of them is a hands-off, like, oh, we don't care. Or the other one is, ridicule, like, oh, we know. That simply is impossible. And that is a disservice, because it basically means that we, the man in the street and the woman in the street, have to fend for ourselves. We have to go out there and try and prove the biggest questions, where we could get a little help from the academics if they so were willing to help us with, but no. And I think this is as you said, in your piece, it is a problem because it means that we are reduced to either believing certain things which we think are okay, but we don't really know, or we have to have this attitude whereby we do rely on science and are a completely reductionist point of view. And to a large extent, that is pretty much what you see out there in the world. You see a world which is torn apart without any real values, because nobody is there to offer them those values, because you either adhere to religion who claims to have the answers, or you are basically stuck trying to answer some of these big questions, but really are ill-equipped to do so, because it's largely one man and one woman for themselves.
Now, in the book Odyssey of the Gods, Eric Van Daniken has been asking whether ancient myths and legends speak of extraterrestrial beings which we have mistaken for gods for more than 45 years. He's been, talking about this. What is new in Odyssey of the Gods that he continues to pose this question? Why did he go about in this direction, focusing on Greece?
Well, he did it because we've all grown up with Greece. Greece is one of those things which, as a teenager, most of the time, we get our teeth stuck in at school. We have to read the Greek myths. And what Eric is showing, there are two categories of Eric's books. One of them is the global voyage, showing us all the evidence which he's accumulated for the ancient alien theory. And then his other books, several of which actually don't quite often get translated from German into English. They tackle specific countries, and this is one such instance where a book did get translated. And he tackles Greece, and the reason why he tackles Greece is because we all think that we know Greece, but Eric is basically showing us that we know very little about Greece. He is, there to tell you that all of these myths which we have learned and read, if not memorized in school, are vastly different. For example, he shows us that some of these myths have in recent decades been extremely liberally translated. And the reason why this happened was because these linguists who were in charge of these translations basically said, well, that doesn't really make sense, but we know, because again, science knows, that we should translate this somewhat differently. So they did. And so what we think of as having an English rendition, or whatever the language we want to pick, Dutch, French, or German, when we think we have an accurate rendition of what the Greek myths actually said in ancient Greek times, no longer is the case. Over the last 2 centuries, more and more liberal translations have occurred. So what he does is he goes back as far as he can to the source, and there you see that it's a completely different story. And he's also underlining certain things which kind of like begin then to make sense. And the example he opens up with is the story of Jason and the Argonauts. It's one of these stories which everybody's heard of, and it's about a Greek hero who goes in search of the Golden Fleece, and he gets a few mates along for the journey, and basically sets off to Colchis to steal the Golden Fleece. Now, what is a Golden Fleece? And we will kind of like have this image of a little lamb which hangs because there's an order of the Golden Fleece, or, in general, as Eric sums it up, basically it's the quest for a piece of fur. And then the first question has to be, why is this important? Why would somebody wage his life to go in search of a piece of fur in a foreign country? And why, oh Greeks, would you write myths about this? So clearly there's something wrong. And so Eric goes in search of the oldest documents and the oldest texts and tries to read them as much in their original format. And you find out that what we consider to be the Golden Fleece is actually something extremely interesting. It's, for example, known that the Greeks believed that the Golden Fleece was an object which could fly. Amongst the people he takes with him to Colchis are people who say to Jason, hey, take me with you, because when you get this thing, I think I'm actually going to be the one who's able to navigate or to fly this for you. He also shows that there are, liberal translations of the dangers which are lurking to get this piece. We would think that these are mythical creatures who are breathing fire and do destruction. But when you are looking again at the original text, you find that there is a regularity to this, and that very much the description which is given is of a defense mechanism. And again, you have people in his party who say, hey, take me with you because I might be able to disable this defensive mechanism. And so we can get through it and basically get to the Golden Fleece. And so, even though 2 centuries ago, there was this campaign to make Jason and the Argonauts into something else than what it was, when you start reading it in its original format, it does actually make sense why the ancient Greeks would have written this down. Because, wouldn't you write down in ancient Greek times, if one of your compatriots went in search of an object which was said to be able to fly? I think the answer would be yes. And so it's one example out of several to basically show that what we think ancient Greece was truly wasn't, and that the ancient Greek civilization, and specifically Atlanteans, holds clear clues that something in ancient Greece was definitely amiss, and that that state of amissness, to coin that term, was the fact that there was a presence of creatures, a tradition of gods who clearly had at their disposal some form of technology, that clearly were stories going around in ancient Greece, which suggested that this bit of ancient technology was still around, and that you have people in ancient Greek times who go in search of this technology and then actually find this. And obviously, when we are talking about technology in those days, the answer is that this is or can only be, or the extreme likelihood is that this is material technology artifacts which are coming from non-human intelligences, i.e. Ancient aliens.
So do you feel that we have been already exposed to the technology if these visitors came to us in ancient times? Do you feel that they shared their technology with us back then?
I do, and I'm absolutely completely with Carl Sagan on this. Now, technology as such, I think what they gave us was knowledge. And Carl Sagan was the one who in 1978 or 79 wrote a book together with a Russian scientist, Intelligent Life in the Universe. And in that, he scoured the archaeological records and the mythological records in search of evidence whether or not we had been contacted in the past. And his conclusion was that the best evidence for this was a story written down by Berosus relating to Oannes. And Oannes is a story of a creature which was half fish and half man, which came out of the Persian Gulf into Babylonia, basically made contact with the people living along the Persian Gulf, and after introducing himself, basically asked them whether they wanted to be taught some sciences like astronomy, mathematics, and various other things. And so when the answer was a positive, Oannes began to instruct him, and Oannes would disappear at night. He would go back into the Persian Gulf. The following morning or a few days later, he would return, and he would continue where he had left off. After a while, Oannes no longer showed up, and another creature came, but that creature was absolutely aware of what Oannes had taught him and picked up where Oannes had left off. And this repeated for a period of time, and in a total of 7 such creatures came, who then went into history down as the 7 sages or the Apkallu. And Carl Sagan and I actually feel that this is an extraordinary confirmation of this fact that civilization was given by otherworldly creatures to mankind. And this is not just something which you find in ancient Babylonian records. It's pretty much something which you find across the world. You have the civilizing deity in ancient Egypt of Osiris, who was said to have brought civilization. You have, the same stories with the Mayans, with Quetzalcoatl, Viracocha in the Inca region. All of these civilizations tell us that our ancestors did not walk the path of civilization alone, but that we were helped by non-human intelligences. And when you were talking about the Native American tradition, that is also something which I touch upon in my book, because basically, it's always there to say that to a large extent, kings and kingship was the primary function of a king or a ruler, was to maintain that link with the other world. And in some cases, I think the problem of the ancient alien field is that over the past 45 years, this has become quite specified in a physical ET presence on Earth. And there's definitely some evidence to suggest that this has happened. But I also think there is another component to this, which is that on a number of occasions, this contact with otherworldly intelligences was in a more spiritual or a more psychic or a more non-physical form. And so an ancient alien, I would like to see defined more as a contact with a non-human intelligence in the past. And in that case, the field is wide open. You're no longer reduced to just look at evidence of ET spacecraft crashing, where there is some evidence for. But basically, you open it up and you realize that all cultures claimed to be in contact with spiritual entities, whatever you want to call them, non-human intelligences, which guided people, guided our ancestors throughout and helped us on the path of civilization to relatively recent in time and maybe to this very day.
Where do you think they went? Do you think they've been here this whole time, or do you think that they have left and they're on their way back?
I think it depends. I think they, I think they're there. I think they are contactable. And when you look at the history, you will find that they are, still being contacted. People who, like Terence McKenna, will tell you that when he took ayahuasca, he made contact with these non-human intelligences. And they, I actually, use him as an example because what they gave to him was a mathematical equation of the nature of time. And it is a great example of these intelligences giving us information, and which basically exceeds our own, technical capabilities or our own, intellectual capabilities. And the time wave zero, as it became to be known, is such a thing. It's something which we have, which Terence McKenna received, but for which we have no real understanding as to what it is supposed to be doing. We know it's a time wave which somehow is a fractal wave, which somehow has to do with when new things happen in time. But that's basically all we know. We know nothing else of this. But this was a contact which he made, in the 1970s. People have made contact since. People are continuing to make contact. So I think for anybody who wants to make contact with these intelligences, you can do it. There's no guarantee that of everything which is out there that you will get any real benefit from this. As always, there are, tricksters, I think, in that other world as well. But there's also information out there to be gleaned and contactable, and for us to receive, which is, when I say genuine, I mean kind of like, of genuine advantage, rather than genuine in the sense that the other contacts would be fake. But, when it comes to things like the UFO phenomenon, I think that is far more complex than most UFO researchers have made us believe. I think it's once again that same redux of the ancient alien question. Are some UFOs, are some contacts with extraterrestrials which have been described in UFO literature physically real? I think the answer is yes. But when you start looking at things like the UFO abduction phenomena, you're really beginning to see that people like Betty Andreas and Luca, for example, she gave, and she's absolutely not unique, but she would say that during some UFO abductions, when they were happening, she was floating to this ship, which was hovering above her home, but that actually she saw her physical body remain behind. Now, clearly, what that means is that she's either hallucinating, if this is what we are going to give, which is the conclusion which the scientists and the skeptics would draw, or that again something else which is far more intriguing and far more elaborate is going on than just this redux. Again, reality is far more complex than just the physical ET component of this, and I think that once we are allowing reality to be far more complex, I think things like the UFO phenomenon, the ancient alien question, and various other things are becoming more in their own and in a better perspective. And it also shows, I think, that this knowledge, this contact with the divine is possible. One of the great things, or one of the great tragedies, is that early Christianity and so many other religions, and an awful lot of heresies like Catharism, what they were always saying was that you did not need to have a middleman to experience the divine. And it was basically the church, the Catholic Church, who changed this. The Catholic Church basically said, like, you just go to a priest, you tell the priest what the problem is, and the priest will resolve it for you, and your soul will be saved. And this tradition over time broke this contact with the divine, and the great heresies like Catharism, basically said, no, you can experience the divine yourself, and allowed for participants to experience the divine for themselves, like so many ancient cultures did, and other cultures in the world, in the New World, at that moment in time were doing. So, that is, I think, something which is a contributing factor as to why, we quite often have this redux of thinking that ancient aliens or UFOs have to be physically real, because we have lost this sense, this realization that reality is far more complex, than we give it credit for.
Well, that's a lot of food for thought. In the book, there's a picture in the illustrated section that shows a picture of metallic plates that were found in Ecuador. And I'm quite fascinated with this picture. This is in Eric Van Daniken's book. And it's a bunch of symbols, and it looks like an alphabet of sort, or, and I'm curious about this, and I was hoping maybe you could talk a little bit about what this is and give us some more information on that.
Yes, it's a great story, actually, and it actually involves a priest called Father Crespi. And Father Crespi was placed in Cuenca in Ecuador, and he was your pretty typical Salesian priest who was there to tell the people as to what it was, Christianity was all about. And he knew that the people were very wary of receiving donations, and so he always said to people, okay, if you want something, you can just come. But people began to bring him gifts because they felt that if they were going to receive something from Father Crespi, basically they had to give something. And the things he was beginning to receive, because the locals realized that he was interested in certain things, like archaeological things, were plates, metal plates. And he began to collect them, and he began to compile them. And after a while, he had this extraordinary collection of metal plates. And in the 1970s, the early 1970s, Eric Van Daniken actually went over there and met Father Crespi and looked at his collection and published about it. And scientists jumped on this and said, well, this is impossible because we know that the locals in Ecuador did not have metal plates. Look at these metal plates; they make no sense whatsoever, and so this is all nonsense. And to a large extent, this is where it remained. Father Crespi continued to collect certain things for a bit longer. Crespi himself, by the way, said that there were indeed within his collection clear copies, clear modern fakes of people who didn't have access to or what he would call the real stuff, but who nevertheless knew that they wanted to give something to Father Crespi in return for the food or whatever, the medicine he was giving them. And so what they did was they basically went in their backyard and fabricated something which looked somewhat similar to the real deal which other people were bringing him. But Father Crespi himself was easily able to identify the real from the clearly fake. In short, the collection continued until Father Crespi died some decades ago, and then his artifacts have been scattered. In fact, a dear friend and fellow researcher of mine, Eileen Hall, whenever she is in Ecuador, she tries to trace down some of where Father Crespi's collections have gone. But in recent years, archaeologists have done a complete turnaround and have now actually found from other places in South America the fact that indeed the natives of Ecuador, Peru, and did indeed have metal, that they used it indeed to make it into extremely tiny sheets of metal, and that they then decorated it or wrote upon this. And of course, they are not touching on Father Crespi, because that would mean that somehow they have to speak ill of fellow academics. But what they have shown is that the collection which Father Crespi collected definitely was exactly what other people have identified in other parts and nearby parts of Ecuador and Peru, and that Father Crespi's collection, is genuine. That it is definitely not just fakes, but that it was real. Unfortunately, as I said just now, most of his collection has either been dispersed or is held by people who really have no interest in going through another scientific confrontation if they were to take it out. So, do we know what this kind of writing is? No, because for 40 years everybody has been living in the assumption that these were just fake, and the few people who did not live with that assumption basically have not had access to the collection or the linguistic skills and help in trying to decipher whether these are just decorations or whether there is indeed a script there. But I guess the positive answer is that if we eventually do get the Crespi collection, and if eventually more of these metal plates surface, then we're at least in a position now, after 40 years, that scientists might actually begin to look at them, and that there is actually a hope that we will get to a moment in time when we are able to read them and understand what these plates are telling us.
Well, it's pretty fascinating, and I encourage everybody listening to get a copy of the book and check it out for themselves. Now, I have to ask this question. You have a writing on your book down the page, on every page of your book, that looks similar, but I'm not sure if it's the same. But I'm curious what you had put that onto your book for and what it meant to you. What exactly is it? Is it the same writing, or is it different, or...?
It is just a group of weird geoglyphs which the typesetter fell in love with, and beautifully displayed on the edges of the book.
It looks really good, by the way. I must say I was quite impressed by that. Now, you mentioned the crystal skulls in your book, and where do they play into all of this?
Well, the crystal skulls play into this because, they are a primary example of objects which, really we have great difficulty in reproducing. Now, in recent years, certain crystal skulls, have been made in places like Brazil and China, and they look quite okay. I was holding one just a few weeks ago in France, and it's a nice piece of skull, and there is some workmanship in there, but there are some skulls which are clearly older, and two skulls, which I have a great affinity with, is Max and the Mitchell Hedges skull. There are some other skulls which are definitely ancient, but these two kind of have been studied more than the others so far. Max is a crystal skull which has been made from a piece of crystal which actually has 6 different types of crystal in, which means that whoever began to play and create with the crystal and eventually created Max out of was an expert in working with crystal, because most people today will tell you that if they were given such a piece of crystal, when they began to work with it to sculpt a skull from, it would probably shatter in several pieces. Yet, in the case of Max, this wasn't the case. In the case of the Mitchell Hedges skull, you have clear crystal with a detachable jaw. And when the Mitchell Hedges skull was taken to the Smithsonian a few years ago, this was because Jane Walsh is absolutely convinced that all crystal skulls are not ancient, that some of these skulls at best have been made at the end of the 19th century in Germany. And basically, Bill Holman took her up on that challenge and took the Mitchell Hedges skull to her. And when her team began to do the analysis, first of all, they were absolutely convinced that the jaw was glass rather than crystal, because they all realized that the jaw couldn't be crystal, that it is pretty much impossible today to create a jaw from the same piece of crystal. And so they did the special light on it, and they realized that it was crystal. And so when you look at the DVD of the continuation of this experiment, you kind of like realize how, again, scientists are trying to hold on to their preconceived ideas, and how she is actually telling off some of these scientists on camera for not kind of like not sticking to the scientific stance which was taken by Jane Walsh on the crystal skulls. But to cut a long story somewhat shorter, it's clear that there are crystal skulls which date back at least to the Mayan times, and that these crystal skulls are ancient, are of indigenous cultures. Some of them are probably still hidden by Native Americans, specifically within the Guatemala, Belize, Yucatan area. And so we don't know how they were made. We don't know who these experts were. One person said, one expert said, when he was asked how the Mitchell-Hedges skull was made, that it would take somebody at least 70 years of continuous, 40 hours a week work into sculpting this. And then you have to remember that there would have been no guarantee whatsoever that during this process the skull would probably shatter because of the detachable jaw and what they were trying to do in the case of the Mitchell-Hedges skull. So we are confronted with an object or objects which defy the known laws of manufacturing these things. There was some kind of technology or understanding as to how to work with crystals, which we no longer have. And that completely leaves out the likelihood that these skulls do indeed contain information, that we are able to tap in this information, and if not communicate with, that they are some kind of communication device, and very much a piece of spiritual technology that if we are in the right mode, if we have the right mindset, if we have the right psychic abilities, that we are actually able to use these skulls and communicate with certain non-human intelligences. So when earlier on I was saying that there is this big tradition, whether it's the Terence McKenna or ancient Egyptians, of civilizations who said that they were guided by these non-human intelligences. There's always a mechanism through which these non-human intelligences came through. In the case of Terence McKenna, it was drinking this magical potion called ayahuasca. In the case of, I think, certain Native American traditions, specifically Middle American traditions, I think the crystal skulls were these enablers, were these devices, these tools, which allowed people to enter this other realm and communicate with the gods, the non-human intelligences.
I'm looking at the pictures in your book, and I am quite fascinated with the locations that you picked to really go into. You picked Peru, and you picked Saqqara and Giza, and the Temple of the Sun in Teotihuacan in Mexico. The Orion alignment, why is that so important?
Well, it is important in this case because what it is showing is a number of things. One of them is and this is like it's not hidden as such, but I always like to write books that if you were to reread them, that on the second reading, you get, certain things more out of, and a bigger pattern begins to appear, which isn't, clearly visible in the first, reading, because you will be focusing on kind of like the more literal trend of the story. But, in the case of Orion, on a primary reading level, if I can say it as such, it's the fact that we have the pyramid complex in Teotihuacan and the pyramid complex at Giza, who both have been identified as having been the layout of Orion's belt. In the case of Giza, this was obviously made extremely famous by Robert Bovell in The Orion Mystery in 1994. And this is one thing. Now, the question then is, why Orion? And you actually have to go into the Mexican tradition to find out that a point just south of Orion's belt was deemed to be a point of creation, that it is said that creation happened in 3112 BC, the beginning of this world age, the famous age which is going to end on the December 21st, 2012, next year, that this age was created from a point just south of Orion's belt, and this is why this is depicted. In fact, the tradition of 2012 says that this age was created when the gods convened specifically in Teotihuacan. So that is basically one of the primary reasons why I say that, and why it is important, because it shows us that our ancestors, whatever civilization they were, had a similar understanding. When it said that the god Atum descends on the Giza Plateau, what we have in Mexico is that we have a similar tradition, which basically says that the gods convened at Teotihuacan. Both instances have to do with Orion's belt, yet we are somehow led to believe by accepted scientists that these two cultures never ever met or even spoke. And I find that highly incredible, because clearly they were building points and complexes, and pyramid complexes to that extent. Not just anything, but pyramid complexes to the same formation, incorporating the same message, and that is truly evidence of the fact that the people of who built Teotihuacan were clearly in contact, or were aware of the tradition of the pyramids in Giza. Science says no, this is impossible. All the evidence clearly suggests otherwise.
Well, you've given us a lot to think about, and I just, we're out of time, and I wish we had another hour to talk about this, because I think we could keep going. Your energy is quite lovely, and the way you discuss all of this is just really fascinating. In the closing moments of the show, what is your hope with all of this research and all of these findings that you have come up with, but also other researchers such as yourself and other authors? What is your hope with this material and the world and the masses and people's consciousness?
That would take an hour. I just hope that people are beginning to understand that they really have to think for themselves, that there is, in the absence of science giving us the answers which we need, that there is reason, and that they should feel allowed to question certain things, that they should feel allowed to question whether God exists, that this is not just some issue of religion, of blind faith. Did ET crash land on planet Earth is not a question of do you believe? Like the standard question is, do you believe in UFOs? The answer is no, I don't believe in UFOs. I search for evidence of UFOs. And that is really, I think, the attitude which we need to take. And the ancient alien question is a guide along those lines. Eric Book is definitely a guide along those lines as well. And I hope that these two books and the other things which I do basically give ammunition is a very hard word. I would say tools for people to help them along these lines when they are questioning these things.
The Ancient Alien Question by Philippe Coppens and The Odyssey of the Gods by Eric Van Daniken, two wonderful tools to add to your library. Philippe, thank you so much. And your website and all your information is located on the homepage of Achieve Radio, and also my website. He will be the featured interview for this month. You can listen live there. And good luck with the book. I hope it becomes a bestseller. And it was a pleasure to talk to you tonight.
It was my pleasure to be on your show, Hillary.
Well, everybody, that's a wrap. Good night. And until next time, namaste.